About 2 years ago, I said in passing that I was going to play a mainline Pokemon game, and I actually did that, but I also kind of didn't have anything I wanted to talk about, and then after booting up my old Wii, what else do I find but an old demo for Pokemon Rumble, which has probably been sitting on that device since 2011. Since I remember liking it as a kid, along with a couple other games not related to the main series, I figured that it would be a lot more interesting to talk about the spin-offs. Not counting Smash Brothers in the trading card game, as of 2025 there are 54 titles that are considered to be a spin-off. For the sake of time and sanity, we're only going to focus on 3 that I felt could have some interesting conversations, but that wasn't to say that the stuff I didn't talk about didn't have anything interesting. Almost every time I was looking into a game, there was just so much stuff to talk about to the point where it was too much. As much as I would have loved talking about the fascinating history of the development prior to Pokemon Snap or the Rumble soundtrack every once in a while deciding to pop off, I also like my free time, so instead I'm going to give you some resources to learn about Jack and the Beanstalk for the 64 disc drive, and a couple songs I found from the Rumble OST if you want to go on a little history tour. We're gonna need something to start this conversation, so I figured the best way to do so is to look at the company that made all of this happen, Ape Inc. It was mostly known as Shigesato Itoi's little band of developers who used to work on the first 2 Mother games, but outside of that development, I get the impression that not a lot of people know what they worked on afterwards or even what happened to the people who work there. You're going to be seeing a couple names get thrown around a lot in this video, but the one particular developer you will need to remember, since I'm going to be bringing him up the most, is this guy, Tsunekazu Ishihara. Some of this information about him seems a little bit incorrect though, because he was cited to have his first job after graduation working for Ape Inc. in 1983 when the company was nothing until 1989, but regardless, the gist is that sometime between then and 1995, he was a developer at Ape Inc., but would then go on to be the guy running the company after they rebranded to Creatures Inc. At the same time, journalist turned game developer Satoshi Tajiri's company is bleeding money after taking longer than expected to develop his sales pitch into a complete game. The studio had to work on the other titles in between to make more money, which would spread the availability to work on Pokemon razor thin, and for a couple developers, they just couldn't work in those conditions and quit. So this is where Creatures Inc. comes in, because what happened is that they offered to give some funding to allow the game to finish in exchange for a 33% stake on the IP, which allowed Game Freak to finish development. Of course, after the game comes out, it becomes one of the best-selling games of all time, and both companies make a lot of money out of it, so they don't hesitate to establish Pokemon as a household franchise. Skip ahead to the wake of the new millennium, and the demand for Pokemon has gotten exponentially bigger after a couple of notable releases, such as Gold and Silver and the release of Pokemon 2000.
Oh, how about 5 more for my friends?
So Creatures Inc., Game Freak, and Nintendo feel like it's a good idea to establish a 3-way agreement that separated the responsibilities between each group to maintain that demand for the franchise, and from this agreement is where we see the establishment of the Pokemon Company, who the founding president was the CEO of Creatures Inc., Tsunekazu Ishihara. Around 2020, Creatures Inc. announced that they were going to acquire Umbrella after buying it out from Marigold Management, who have basically since 1998 been exclusively making cult classic Pokemon spin-off games. It's not like when they made something it was going to be shattering the world with how good it was, if we're being honest here, but they were budget titles made by like a handful of people, but what they lacked in manpower or funding, they had an abundance of I totally understand that most if not all the games they made were exclusively shovelware, but at the same time it's kind of been drilled into people's heads for years at this point that those restrictions, or lack of one, doesn't immediately make a game bad or have no value out of a gamer. It's what the studio did with that money that decides a game's overall quality. And it's not like Umbrella was the biggest studio ever either. Their team size when they made a game would go as small as less than 15 people at certain points, so they had to be extremely resourceful with what they had to work with. As you're about to see, usually that means having 1 or 2 aspects of the game carry nearly everything that people like about it. I can imagine that when they were trying to make their first game, that aspect was simply just trying to make an N64 game that was the most unique of its library, for better or worse. This is the one game that I looked into where I didn't actually have any developer insight, so instead I chose to go out of my way to play through the game and talk about how I felt while playing it. But basically the point of the game is that you're a lab helper for an experimental communication device made by Professor Oak.
問題があってな。
俺が遅刻したことにも問題があります。
ならば
I wouldn't give it too much thought about how the driving mechanic is a device used to talk to Pokemon when you were able to do that already. It was a much earlier time in the franchise where there wasn't quite an established rulebook for how wild animals were supposed to act, and obviously looking at this game with a modern perspective of what the franchise will become is a little bit unfair to the game. I just don't get any satisfaction from being a smug asshole about a plot hole I found in my non-canon 28-year-old video game. The big gimmick of this game is that it uses a VRU accessory, which is just this microphone setup that you plug into port 4 so that you can tell Pikachu to do shit. The Nintendo 64 only had 2 games that would have ever used this device, although the second game was a Japanese exclusive port of Densha De Go, and even then it kinda didn't count since that was an optional accessory. The actual baby shit. Who the Ratatate, like Andrew Tate. It's Raticate, close enough. Tourist? Shut the f— The game is quite literally one of a kind of its library, but that also made it a massive weakness for this game as well, because there were 2 very big issues it had that became a vocal complaint when this game came out. The first being that the VRU had a lot of trouble picking up a wide range of voices, resulting in one layer of frustration with the interface. It's not really an issue anymore on emulation since some people in the Mupen 64 team went out of their way to reverse engineer the VRU, so that most people aren't forced to play on a cheap piece of shit anymore. But as I was already insinuating, there was another layer of frustration people will have with the game, and that's due to how a lot of players tend to be antagonistic to the game design. The game itself is barely difficult, believe it or not, but for some reason the game doesn't give you the full control scheme or the staple commands and either expects you to have known it already, waiting for Professor Oak to give you the right context to say things, or you have to eat shit before you can start having fun, which leaves a terrible first impression for a lot of players. The most common criticism I see on this game is the very first mission event, where you have to get ingredients for a picnic, and I think that mostly has to do with how up to that moment, most players probably couldn't have the right context to know what exactly they should be doing, so they get frustrated when they can't do the objective correctly. Now, my playthrough was a completely blind one without the instruction booklet, so I had no idea how to play up to that point. And when I got to the picnic event, I also had a lot of trouble getting Pikachu to do the objective, since it seemed like there was no means to make him explore the area to find ingredients. However, the game later on gives you an explicit tutorial on how to move around the environment, and after learning that, I was able to beat the picnic event on the first try. What definitely helped improve my experience when I was playing it was that I had to keep reminding myself that the Pikachu here isn't a pet. It's a wild animal that has the behavior of a little kid. So in a way, in order for me to have fun with the game, I have to accommodate for the game, since it's not going to be able to process information as fast as I would like it to. By design, you're supposed to speak more than one time so that you can get Pikachu's attention first, and then your command afterwards. They don't usually follow you when you move around the map, so you have to repeatedly ask them to go to you when you want them somewhere. Long sentences will be too confusing, so you have to reduce your commands to simple phrases. If you give the game time to experiment around with how you communicate with it, you get rewarded by being able to do the missions better, get the ingredients faster, or at the bare minimum, play the game in a way where you actually know what the hell you're doing. But none of this matters if most players are just not going to put in the time when most if not all the experience they have with this game is how awful it feels to play at the start. I don't think the year's worth of YouTubers who made essays about how bad this game is were wrong in their assumptions, because back then, you didn't have an emulator at your disposal to play the game on, so on top of the fact that you need to find out what works and what doesn't, sometimes the game will just eat your fucking input, which might cause players to mistake that as the wrong context, or blame the microphone for something that was a deliberate game design choice, and vice versa. So maybe it's more appropriate to say that Hey You Pikachu wasn't a bad game, but it was a bad N64 game. So if you do get the chance, maybe try the game again with this new information. I'm certain you might find your attitude toward this game might be a lot better than when you first started. Spike Chunsoft is a big name you might be familiar with. In Japan, they are mostly known for their work as a localization team that releases Western titles over to Japan with big names in their portfolio like Metro Exodus or The Witcher 3. But internationally as a publisher, they are mostly known for their latest work making big name titles Danganronpa or the Budokai Tenkaichi games. But if you go back to like the early 90s when Chunsoft was still like a thing, you might notice that they were also the people responsible for the development of the original Dragon Quest series back in 1986. Now when they were working on Dragon Quest 4, they also developed a strange little spin-off game called Torneko's Great Adventure. It was a roguelike spin-off based around the merchant Torneko exploring a particularly mysterious dungeon. After clearing a tutorial dungeon, the king gives Torneko the approval to explore the real deal so that he can acquire rare treasure that he can sell at his store, and he uses this adventure to become one of the best merchants in the world. It never really got a US release, but after its great reception by Japanese critics back in 1993, Chunsoft thought it was a great idea to keep making games based around this idea and iteratively improved on the concept by the time it got some attention outside of Japan, and from there we would be introduced into a particular franchise you might know today as Mystery Dungeon. From what I saw, while it wasn't the first game in the franchise to get a US release, Mystery Dungeon debuted as a PS1 remake of the original game titled Torneko: The Last Hope, with this gormless-ass box art. And since it was already an established IP in Japan, it actually did pretty well. In the United States though, you could say it didn't really meet the quota. It's not a big surprise why it didn't do so well, mostly because Dragon Quest as an IP wasn't very popular in the United States due to a death of 1,000 paper cuts.
How could you do this? Oh, well, excuse me for being the most terrible man on the planet. Oh, I'm a terrible man. What are you doing? What is that?
Their very first localization was outsourced to Nintendo of America, who just stripped all of the personality from the game so that they could sell it like a generic American RPG. The franchise in the United States completely missed out on the RPG mainstream boom that was caused by Final Fantasy VII, and most people who were DQ fans had to deal with an 8-year content drought since the localizers skipped over the SNES era. And when they did modernize the older titles in an attempt to revitalize the interest for the series, the only way to play them, some to this day mind you, was exclusively for the DS and mobile ports due to the idea that since handhelds were popular in Japan, the same metric would apply in a completely different market. And then, unsurprisingly, it did horribly in a different market. Another thing to note is that Dragon Quest didn't even start out popular in Japan, and what helped get more sales was a Shonen Jump adaptation in 1989 that became one of the best-selling mangas of all time, and the only meaningful US equivalent of that was the Smash Bros. Ultimate collab, and a little thing called... Regardless, the point is that while the initial release for Mystery Dungeon was really poor in the US, it found a better chance in the market once Chunsoft treated the series as a blueprint for other IPs, rather than just being a spin-off for Dragon Quest. As for when Pokemon decided to be a part of that franchise, that by itself has a whole story behind it as well, beginning with Tetris of all things. Ishihara wanted to acquire the Tetris IP, so he flew over to Russia, but then found out that a guy called Hank Rogers got the rights a little before he could, and after a little slap in the dick and a how do you do, they became friends by the time Tetris 2 plus Bombless was in the middle of development, which just so happened to be co-developed by Chunsoft. And since Ishihara was a big fan of the Mystery Dungeon IP, he decided to get in touch with Koichi Nakamura, and from there we got Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red and Blue Rescue Team. It wasn't exactly the most pleasant development from what I read about, since at the time Chunsoft was basically one foot in bankruptcy after a couple notable releases not doing so hot. In an interview I found with Koji Malta, who is also another Ape Inc. dev credited for programming Mother 2, he kinda talks a bit about how it got so bad that he was practically looking for the door when he was working on PMD among a couple other developers, and even the company wasn't really expecting the game to sell very well. I don't think I'd be in a position to talk about the game since I never actually played it, but what I can talk about is the plot, and I really liked how they got a lot of mileage off the plot device that is, I got turned into a Pokemon. Since you're walking into an environment with no context to the world around you, most of the cast already knows that you're a human because there's really no issue with that information yet, and then everybody finds out about a world-ending prediction where a human turned Pokemon is the trigger. It becomes a massive conflict between the player and everyone around them, and it's considered to be the best part of the game for a reason. Through all of the issues that someone might have with the series, the value comes from how well written these games are. It also seems like TPC noticed how good the stories were as well and gave the franchise a couple animated specials and 3 manga adaptations. I read through the first one and it was actually really neat to look at. Some of the story had to get rearranged and it had a different ending, but it was still a pretty fun read.
Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX is a remake that feels like putting a band-aid on a flawed game that badly needed major surgery instead. While the story and presentation have been drastically improved with fun characters and an impressive new art style, its core is still painfully dull. Key areas like dungeon crawling and combat are as monotonous and repetitive as ever.
God, they fucking hate this game. I also feel like I need to address the Blue Rescue Team IGN review because a lot of people got mad at it for what it had to say. If anything, the series in general had a major disconnect where critics look at it unfavorably while the consumer looks at it like it's the best game ever made. And I think with the context we just established, I think I can explain why. For a critic's point of view, they might have already known that this is a spin-off of the Fushigi no Dungeon franchise, which as of this game coming out, was already 12 years old. The PS1 game that came out in 2000 was the point of reference for a lot of critics, and that game was already harshly criticized back then too. So when they see a game that got panned back then come out with a spin-off with basically the same gameplay, they're gonna repeat the same talking points, if not claim that the game design is outdated. The problem with that response though comes from the fact that kids in the United States barely even had the chance to play those games. So to them, this was their first Mystery Dungeon game, even if they didn't realize that it's already a decade-old formula. So when they see a bunch of critics going around calling the game outdated or reciting a talking point straight out of the PS1 Torneko review, they're going to be wondering what the hell they're talking about and get upset that their favorite video game is being given a 6.5 for seemingly arbitrary reasons. A lot of the time when they do review the game, it's almost always just about the gameplay, and I feel like that's extremely unfair to do for those games. And the gameplay for Mystery Dungeon isn't even that bad. It's like some critics only said it was bad because it's just old game design, which is just a terrible mentality to have while reviewing something. The turn-based RPG is a 50-year-old game design, and the only reason why people don't go back to the older titles is simply because the graphics don't age very well. It's become inaccessible over time, or they're just riddled with bullshit. It was never the gameplay itself that made the game bad, and if that was the case, then shouldn't we be seeing more critics beating the shit out of Atlus for making Persona 5 with this so-called antiquated game mechanic? Regardless, I think one key element that also gets left out from these critics tends to be the fact that they never allow the game to even tell them their story, which is like why people even buy these games in the first place. This becomes especially frustrating when you see that when Explorers came out, it got a 4.9 with barely any mention of the story, but it was considered by fans to be the best game in the franchise because it had an excellent story.
The episodes go into their backstory and the reasons why they joined the guild. Unfortunately, these episodes end up being mostly cutscenes, like you wanted to read a novel about Bidoof's self-esteem issues.
I get that a lot of the gameplay has not changed over the course of the 10 years that it took to become a Pokemon game, but when the main criticism of the game gets to the point where the only way that a critic can be happy about it is to take away everything that makes it a Mystery Dungeon game, then that's just simply bad criticism. Luckily, kids aren't really that concerned with what critics say on the internet. If you do get a chance to play this game, there is a remake on the Switch, and Red Rescue Team is officially on the GBA lineup for Switch Online. The main difference between the two games is ultimately how they look and sound, but it's still basically the same game. Regardless, I think you'll still have a lot of fun with it. When I was trying to look into our last game, there really was not a lot of information about its development, but I did find that it started with a guy from Namco called Masaaki Hoshino, who prior to this game started out as a programmer that worked on the Soul Calibur games up until he became a producer for the franchise. One really notable attribute about Hoshino was that he was a massive fan of Pokemon. This dude liked the game so much that he actually started a club within Namco all about the franchise and would usually once a year host 2 local tournaments, which ended up cementing quite a culture within his time working for the company. Now, around 2013, Ishihara was meeting with Bandai Namco since there was an offer on the table to make a Taiko no Tatsujin spin-off. But Ishihara was not really interested in that since he was actually meeting with Bandai Namco to see if he can get someone to make a fighting game for him. And I have to paraphrase the next few details since it's not very well explained, but sometime before development started, Ishihara noticed the enthusiasm Hoshino had for his IP and then directly asked if he wanted to be a director for the game. And after 2 years of development and an 8-month cycle to port it from the arcades to the Wii U, on March 18th, 2016, we were introduced to the worldwide release of Pokkén Tournament.
In dual gears, but you'll need the way you move. Let's practice by pressing forward twice on the directional button.
As I said before, my resources are very limited since there was an interview with Harada and Hoshino that was circulated back in 2014 while the game was still in development. However, the video is currently privated, so I don't get much info on what was said there or even what Hoshino and Harada were truly responsible for. But I do have a bunch of articles that summarized it discussing some things about the game, so we're just gonna go with that. Also, I do want to explain how this game works, but not to the point where I have to teach you how to play. If you really want to learn it, there's dozens of guides out there by the community, and even then the in-game tutorial should be good enough to get you started. They reduce the amount of attack buttons you get down to 2 options, and motion inputs are broken down to moving your stick in a direction and then just hitting the button. In return, the gameplay had to carry a lot of that complexity to ensure that it's still fun to play. So the decision to make it a hybrid between a 3D and arena fighter is definitely an interesting way to compensate for the controller complexity. The big difficulty from then on becomes how to put the two together, since the control schemes in both genres are not really interchangeable. interchangeable. In an arena fighter, the player can freely move around the X, Y, and Z axis, whereas a 3D fighter restricts it down to 2, while the third axis is used to rotate around the opponent. We actually do have a point of reference for other attempts that were made to try out this hybrid technique with a game like Bushido Blade, where the main gameplay focuses on a slower 3D fighter in an attempt to make a semi-realistic sword fighting simulator. But the function I want to look at for this game is the ability to freely move around by holding down a button. It's definitely a really cool feature to have, but the problem is that you're not really going to be using that run function outside of trying to get yourself in a better position that wouldn't be possible on the 3D fighter mode as is. And while you can still attack, you can't really defend while running, and while it can help a lot, it's not vital to know how to use it to be good at the game. So for a lot of players, this is kind of a redundant ability. And from what I see in the gameplay and tutorials, the way Bandai Namco made Pokkén work when other attempts didn't was by introducing the phase shift mechanic. It's basically the game's way of telling the player as clearly as possible that they are moving from arena to 3D and vice versa. At all times, there is going to be a UI element that allows you to know which mode you are going on, along with a distinct camera angle to go with it. And that's super great for people that might get confused. It's also a way to ensure that you can't just sit in one phase the whole match, as they introduce incentives to do a phase shift as well. When you start the match, it will always be in the slower and less damaging field phase, which generally means that the early game is all about giving yourself more time than a usual fighting game to test out what cracks your opponent's defense, or reveal their flowchart without immediately losing half your health just to find out what Kazuya's down forward 2 does when you poke on minus. And while the field phase isn't the most exciting part of the game, it makes it as clear as possible that the win condition of Pokkén is all about how you win on every phase shift, and then starve your opponent of the benefits you get from being the player that triggers it. For example, if I phase shift from field to duel, I get 50% of my recoverable health back and a lot of points to my synergy burst, and the opponent will lose all of their recoverable HP. So even if my character is really strong on field, I would probably want to try to fish out a phase shift in my advantage so the other player gets less resources to have a comeback. There's such a steep learning curve with this one simple adjustment to gameplay, which allowed this game to be probably one of the most interesting approaches to being a new player-friendly game that I've seen. It doesn't feel like it's arbitrarily holding itself back, and with the simplified control scheme that can even work on a fight stick, which is kind of unusual for an arena fighter, mind you, this game had the potential to be a very strong title for the audience that wanted a fresh take on the fighting game genre, while also being made for an audience with a lower tolerance to all the bullshit that comes with being a part of the FGC. Don't get me wrong, they will still eventually have to deal with bullshit like metas and character-specific knowledge checks, but the game has a much greater tolerance for mistakes while still being at the same pace as all those other games. It's not all perfect though. You're going to be playing this on Nintendo Switch Online on a delay-based netcode title, so if anyone you play with isn't wired up, then it's going to be a gamble on the overall match experience. Local matchmaking isn't exactly an improvement either, since if you intend to play on a comp match, you'll be pretty much forced to either play on a split screen at a 30 FPS cap, or buy another console and copy of the game. And that can be a very quick logistical nightmare for a TO trying to start a legitimate Pokkén scene. Now, while these are very big drawbacks, the game still did pretty well to the point where it was able to outsell Street Fighter V for a small period of time. But even then, it was still going to be really hard to reach later stages of adoption without some amount of presence in the FGC that can really show off what this game is all about. And at the moment, a lot of people might have thought that would have been done through EVO 2016. That is not what happened at EVO 2016.
And it begins Grand Finals of EVO 2016 Pokkén Tournament. Tonosama from losers, Buntan in winners. Let's go. You never get to see that from Tonosama.
Apparently, yeah.
Oh yeah, he's back to a battle, so we're gonna see this situation a lot. Oh, and it's so nice.
It's such a random patch.
I don't even know why they didn't get Tonosama walking into that waterfall.
Okay, not close enough to counter it, but not close enough.
Oh, anyway, we'll see. Nice. That's sweeping damage, 30% of your HP.
And you have a lot of time to come from off.
I gotcha!
Oh my goodness.
Learning me every time I watch him. I'm taking notes. Hold up. Pull out the notepad. Flamethrower into X.
There's dozens of videos that already went through why this event was a complete disaster for the game's reputation, so I'm not going to repeat the same points. But I did notice a couple discussions where people were blaming the guy who won for this game looking really bad, which, no. If you want someone to blame, it was the publisher's fault for not making an experimental fighting game have a worldwide release to ensure that there isn't a discrepancy of skill. It was EVO's fault for not taking into account that the US players only had 4 months to learn how to establish a metagame in one of the largest international fighting game tournaments. I hate to break it to you, but Tonosama winning the tournament by laming their opponent out with a broken assist didn't hurt the game's reputation as hard as the 2 days where the attendance saw hundreds of matches from players that might as well have just picked the game up. Just saying. A large part of the community is confident in believing that a sequel might come out, but whether or not that sequel will be actually good is kinda up for debate. For one, it's very likely the game is not going to be made by the same people. Like, sure, we already assume that Harada will be there, but Hoshino is just straight up a ghost nowadays. Seriously, post-2022, there is like no information about this guy except for maybe his Facebook account. On Bulbapedia, he got credited as the technical director for TPC, but if you look that roll up on LinkedIn, it's occupied by someone else. And you would assume that the former director of Soul Calibur would at least have a Wikipedia page. The only recent articles I could find about Pokkén never bring up Hoshino and credit most of the work to Harada or Tekken. At the end of the day, I'm just stuck wondering what the hell this guy did to straight up stop existing. Regardless, I would hope that a sequel is made out of respect for the community rather than out of the desire to make a number go up, but as you already know, this might not happen. Best case scenario, it's the same game but with ray tracing. Worst case, 5 months in you have another Tekken 8 Genmaji Temple controversy, except the map fucking sucks too. I originally was going to end the video up to this point, but I guess I figured that I still had some stuff to say about TPC, or to be more specific, the state of their latest releases, mostly due to how we're about to get a sequel to one of their more divisive games in the franchise within the year. Prior to 2022, I think a lot of people were already a little frustrated with the games, either because the story was bad, most of the animation looked like a Yakuza side story cutscene, or whatever else that could be considered a grievance. I can imagine that as an adult who might be still into these games, it can be hard to express that frustration without having it be shut down by a community that is going to be mostly comprised of children and blind consumers that will like the game regardless of its quality. So when Scarlet and Violet came out with the game breaking bugs and a major controversy that led to Nintendo having to offer refunds for the game, all that built up sentiment finally had a place to go, and with the inevitable explosion of hatred for this company, people started to pay attention. So being the direct follow-up to what just happened while the experience is still fresh on a couple people's minds due to the ongoing Palworld lawsuit, it's safe to say that this is going to be a game that is going to get a lot of judgment about its value, and they are not going to be fair judgments. And since I already know some people will hear that and think that I'm promoting toxic positivity, let's talk about that. It'll help if you understand what that's supposed to mean. So for the conversation, toxic positivity is going to be the lack of an ability to express any feelings of sadness or anger to something. And as you just saw, this is what happens when you allow that kind of condition into a community for long enough. A channel for people to actually talk about those kinds of issues is the healthiest way to deal with that frustration. However, when that channel is starting to be used to operate a personal crusade against people you disagree with about a subject, now you're just being as toxic as the very community you're being critical of. I'm fully aware of the importance of criticism, but I strongly disagree with the idea that the way we make people better consumers is by indiscriminately attacking that community for wanting to buy a video game. In a community where there are grown-ass men getting in fistfights over cardboard, people that suspiciously make every joke be about how they want to fuck an animal, and a retro market that arbitrarily shoots the price up, making some of the point of references you want out of the franchise becoming financially and legally impossible to play anymore, some dude expressing his excitement for a modern Pokemon game is kind of a weird thing to be getting mad at. If you want to have a conversation, that's perfectly fine, but it's not a conversation when everyone's just going to be talking over each other. Whether you like it or not, if you care about this kind of stuff and want to actually make some progress with people, you're eventually going to have to pull that head out of your ass and start listening to people. This goes both ways between the speaker and the listener, but maybe we can put a pin on this conversation for another time so we can look at that a bit more. I'm just going to keep this simple for now because it's very obvious that a lot of people who are going to be going into this aren't doing it because they actually care about Pokemon, but because they want to start a fight so that they can get paid every time someone reacts to their bullshit. I might not be a massive fan, but I still know a powder keg when I see one, so it's a good idea for now to not engage with others, at least until the game's been out for a couple weeks. At the end of the day, this is all going to be about a video game, and if people have to get hurt or bullied out of your community for you to get slightly better animation cycles from Game Freak, then maybe the reason why people are pushing back against your opinions isn't a toxic positivity problem, it's a you problem. But what do I know? I'm only just a tourist after all, right?
Just like in every song that you've heard from near and far, there was a man named Johnny, and yes, he played guitar. He was the guitar king, but he only played one thing. The people flocked from far and wide to hear him play one string.